Doctors, when did you realize your hospital was hiding something dark? Mrs. De Irwin grabbed my arm, complaining about a horrible smell in her room for 3 days straight. Dr. Fowler, please. The smell is getting worse. It's like something died in here. I patted her hand gently and assured her maintenance had checked the vents twice already. Mrs. De Irwin had mild dementia, and the nurses had already moved her to a different room once, but she insisted the smell followed her. Over the next few days, her complaints intensified. She refused to eat, saying the smell made her nauseous. She barely slept and kept asking to be moved. The nursing staff was getting frustrated because we had limited beds and couldn't keep accommodating what seemed like paranoid delusions. On day 5, Mrs. Irwin became more agitated. She started refusing to stay in her room at all and would wheel herself to the nurses' station. Other patients began complaining that she was disrupting their rest with her frequent outbursts. "There's something under my bed," she insisted when I tried to coax her back to her room. I actually got down on my hands and knees to look under her bed just to calm her down. There was nothing but dust bunnies and a forgotten pen. I helped her back into bed and increased her anxiety medication. The next morning, Mrs. Irwin's daughter arrived for a visit and immediately complained about an odor. This caught my attention because visitors usually noticed hospital smells more than staff. I called maintenance again, and they promised to do a deep clean of the room. But Mrs. Irwin refused to wait. She packed her belongings into a plastic bag and announced she was leaving against medical advice. She kept saying something terrible had happened in that room, and she could feel it. "Mom, you need to finish your recovery here. Your surgery site could get infected. I'd rather die at home than spend another night with that smell." Security was called when Mrs. Irwin tried to leave through the emergency exit. It became a whole scene with her screaming about dead bodies while other patients and visitors watched in alarm. We had to sedate her, which made me feel terrible, but she was becoming a danger to herself. That evening I decided to spend some time in room 304 myself. Maybe if I sat there long enough I'd notice whatever was bothering Mrs. Irwin. I did paperwork in her room for an hour, but detected nothing unusual. The same antiseptic hospital smell we all knew. 3 days later, Mrs. Irwin's daughter called to say her mother had passed away at home. She'd never recovered from the trauma of her hospital stay and kept talking about the smell until the end. I felt guilty, wondering if we'd missed something medical that could have saved her. Room 304 stayed empty for a week, which was unusual given our typical capacity. Nurses whispered that it felt wrong somehow. Even rational medical professionals can develop superstitions, and Mrs. Irwin's behavior had unsettled everyone. Eventually, a new patient was assigned to the room, but he requested a transfer after one night. "There's a weird smell," he said, like something crawled into the walls and died. This time, I took it seriously. I called maintenance and insisted on a thorough investigation. They checked everything from the HVAC system to the plumbing. They even brought in a specialized team to look for mold or dead animals in the walls. Nothing turned up, but the smell complaints continued. 2 weeks after Mrs. Irwin's death, a water pipe burst in the room below 304. Maintenance had to remove several floor tiles to access the damaged pipe. That's when they called the police. Under the tiles directly beneath where Mrs. Irwin's bed had been, they found a sealed plastic bag. Inside was a human hand. The police sealed off the entire ward as a crime scene. They brought in forensic teams. The hand had been deliberately placed there and sealed to slow decomposition, but not enough to prevent the smell from seeping through. Investigators questioned all the staff about who had access to that room. They pulled employment records going back years. The hand was sent for DNA testing. The hospital administrators were in full damage control mode, worried about lawsuits and publicity. I couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Irwin. She'd been right all along, and we'd dismissed her as delusional. The guilt was overwhelming, especially when her daughter called, asking if her mother's death was connected to what they'd found. The DNA results came back, but raised more questions than answers. The hand belonged to a nurse who'd worked on our floor 5 years ago. The problem was, she was very much alive, and still had both hands. She'd moved to another state, and was shocked when police contacted her. Someone had used tissue samples to create a convincing fake. "Who would do something like this?" Nurse Maya asked during our staff meeting. The detective leading the investigation had a theory, but needed more evidence. He mentioned that Mrs. Irwin had been a nurse herself 40 years ago at this very hospital. She'd worked this exact floor when it was the psychiatric ward. The placement might not have been random at all. "We're looking into cold cases from her time here," the detective said. "Someone wanted her specifically to find this. The question is why." Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Detective Barnett leaned forward and tapped the folder on the table. Whoever did this knew exactly which room she'd be assigned to. He pulled out a chart showing bed assignments from the past month. They knew her surgery date, her recovery timeline, everything. My stomach twisted as I stared at the papers. The precision of this whole thing makes my skin crawl. The door suddenly burst open, and Sloane Rosen from Risk Management rushed in. "Stop this discussion immediately." She looked around the room with panic in her eyes. "Everything needs to go through legal channels from now on." She pointed at each of us. "The hospital could face massive liability if we don't handle this properly." Detective Barnett just stared at her coldly and closed his folder. "This is a criminal investigation, not a liability issue." Sloane's face turned red, but she didn't back down. "I'm calling the legal department right now." She stormed out and slammed the door behind her. That evening, I went straight home and dug through my desk for Mrs. Irwin's file. I spread out every incident report I'd written across my kitchen table. Each note I'd written felt like a punch to the gut. Patient continues to complain about non-existent odor. Increased anxiety medication per standard protocol. Patient exhibiting signs of paranoid delusion. I should have listened to her. I should have taken her seriously. The next morning, Detective Barnett called and asked me to meet him at the hospital. "I need you to walk me through the ward layout." We started at the nurses' station and worked our way down the hall. I showed him the maintenance corridors hidden behind unmarked doors. Anyone with a key could access these. He took photos of every entrance and exit. We checked the storage rooms filled with supplies and old equipment. How many people have access to these areas? I counted on my fingers. Maybe 30 staff members, plus maintenance crews. The detective wrote everything down in his notebook. Edison Walker from facilities met us outside room 304 with a stack of blueprints. "You wanted to know about the flooring system?" He unrolled the papers on a nearby cart. "This whole section was renovated 15 years ago after water damage." He pointed to the specific area under where Mrs. Irwin's bed had been. "The original tiles from the 80s are underneath the new ones." Detective Barnett studied the blueprints carefully. "I need all maintenance records going back 40 years. Edison nodded and said he'd pull everything from storage. Later that afternoon, Detective Barnett gathered us in the conference room again. The DNA results are more complicated than we thought. He passed around a lab report. "The hand belongs to a nurse who worked here 5 years ago." Everyone started talking at once, but he held up his hand. "She's alive and still has both hands." The room went silent. Someone harvested her tissue samples or DNA from something she touched regularly. He looked around at our shocked faces. "This isn't just revenge, it's sophisticated planning." That evening, I finally worked up the courage to call Mrs. Irwin's daughter. My hands shook as I dialed her number. She answered on the third ring, and I could barely get the words out. "I'm so sorry we didn't believe your mother." There was a long silence on the other end. She was right all along and we failed her. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. "I just want to know why someone targeted her." We agreed to stay in contact as the investigation continued. The hospital administrator called an emergency meeting the next day. "We need this ward back to normal operations immediately." She looked stressed and kept checking her phone. "We're running out of beds, and the publicity is affecting admissions." I wanted to scream that a woman died because we ignored her. Patient safety should be our priority, not bed counts. She glared at me and continued with her presentation about damage control. That night I couldn't sleep, so I went back to room 304. The crime scene tape was gone, but the room still felt wrong. I sat on the edge of the empty bed frame and tried to understand what Mrs. Irwin experienced. The ventilation system hummed softly above me. I noticed small scratches on the floor tiles I'd never seen before. The room felt heavy with the weight of what happened here. Something terrible had occurred in this space, and Mrs. Irwin had sensed it. The next morning, Nurse Maya pulled me aside in the hallway. "I've been hearing things from the older staff." She looked around to make sure no one was listening. "About the psychiatric ward days." She mentioned restraint deaths that were never properly investigated, patients who just disappeared from the records. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "One nurse said they used to keep problem patients in room 304 for weeks at a time." The stories made my blood run cold. Nobody wanted to work that room back then. The stories made my blood run cold. 2 days later, Detective Barnett showed up at the nurses' station asking for Edison Walker. He wanted to see how the building looked back when it was a psychiatric ward. Edison arrived 20 minutes later carrying a ring of old keys and led us down to the basement storage area where they kept the original architectural plans. The storage room smelled like mold and old paper. Edison pulled out tube after tube of rolled blueprints until he found the ones from 1962. We spread them across a dusty table, and Detective Barnett took photos with his phone. Room 304 had thick walls marked as reinforced concrete, and there was a special observation window drawn into the plans. Edison pointed to the bolt marks on the floor diagram, showing where the restraint bed would have been secured. The detective measured the placement against his notes, and everything matched where we found the hand. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with an email from Sloane Rosen marked urgent and sent to all staff. She wrote that nobody was allowed to talk to police without a hospital lawyer present, and anyone who did would face immediate suspension. The nurses at the station were reading it too, and everyone looked nervous. Maya whispered that Sloan had been making calls all morning to the legal department. The next morning, Edison brought the blueprints to my office and spread them out on my desk. He showed me how room 304 used to have a reinforced door frame designed to withstand patient violence, and the observation window let staff watch without entering. The bed bolts were positioned exactly where Mrs. Irwin's hospital bed had sat, and the hand was buried right under where the restraints would have held someone's wrist. Edison said the precision couldn't be coincidence. During my lunch break, I grabbed a notebook and started mapping out everything that happened from when Mrs. Irwin first complained to when we found the hand. I wrote down dates and times and who was working each shift. The timeline showed her complaint started exactly 3 days after she was admitted to room 304. Someone knew she'd be placed there and planted the hand just before her arrival. The pattern was too perfect to be random. I tracked down the new patient who'd complained about the smell before his discharge. He was packing his belongings when I knocked on his door. I asked him to describe what he smelled, and he said it was sweet and rotten like meat left in the sun. That was exactly how Mrs. Irwin had described it. He said the smell got stronger at night and seemed to come from below the bed. His validation of her experience made my chest tight with guilt. Detective Barnett called a meeting that evening and revealed the hand wasn't even real human tissue. It was a sophisticated prosthetic made from medical-grade silicone, but someone had seeded it with actual DNA to fool the initial tests. Creating something like that would take serious medical knowledge and access to lab equipment. He said whoever did this had deep connections to the hospital and planned everything months in advance. Edison offered to show me the maintenance tunnels the next day so I could understand how someone accessed the space under 304. We met at 7 in the morning before the day shift arrived. He led me through a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only" and down metal stairs into the subfloor. The tunnels were narrow and filled with pipes and electrical conduits. Edison had to duck to avoid hitting his head on the low ceiling. We followed the main corridor until we reached the section under the patient rooms. Edison showed me 3 different access points someone could use to reach the space under 304 without being seen. The security cameras didn't cover any of these entrances. Someone who knew these routes could move through the building completely undetected. That afternoon, Sloan called me to her office and closed the door behind us. She sat behind her desk and started listing all the ways this investigation could destroy the hospital. She mentioned lawsuits that could reach millions and how the publicity would make people afraid to come here for treatment. Then she brought up 3 previous complaints the hospital had quietly settled over the years. She said getting too involved in this investigation would end my career here. Her hands were shaking as she talked, and I could see how desperate she was to contain this situation. Detective Barnett stopped by my office later with more information about the placement. He'd been studying the old psychiatric ward records and found that the plastic bag was buried exactly where the seclusion bed's restraint bolts would have been. Someone knew the precise historical layout down to the inch. He said this felt like a message about something specific that happened in that exact spot 40 years ago. The killer wanted us to make this connection. After the detective left, I walked down to the pathology lab looking for Kira McLean. She was alone processing tissue samples when I knocked on the door frame. I asked if she could help me understand how someone could create such a convincing fake hand with embedded DNA. She dropped the slide she was holding and it shattered on the floor. While she cleaned up the glass, she said she'd look into what materials and techniques someone would need, but she had to be careful about it. Something about the way she avoided eye contact made me think she knew more than she was saying. 2 days later, Mrs. Irwin's daughter called me at work, just as I was finishing my morning rounds. She sounded tired and said she'd been going through her mother's old things from her nursing days. She told me her mom had worked the psychiatric ward here in the 80s and kept journals about it. Her voice got quiet when she described entries about patients being tied down for days at a time. She said her mother wrote about the screams that echoed through the halls at night. The worst part was how her mom never spoke up about what she saw happening. She'd written about feeling like a coward for staying silent when doctors gave too much medication. Mrs. Irwin's daughter said her mom carried that guilt for 40 years until she died. After hanging up, I walked straight to medical records and filled out a formal request for all incident logs from room 304. The clerk behind the desk looked confused when I asked for records going back to when it was a seclusion room. She said those would be in deep storage and might take weeks to pull, but she'd start the process. I signed every form she gave me and made copies for myself, just to be sure. That afternoon, Edison found me in the cafeteria and sat down with his lunch tray looking worried. He'd been thinking about the building's history and remembered something from 20 years ago. There'd been a huge flood in that wing when old pipes burst during winter. The whole floor had to be gutted and rebuilt over several months. He said crews had access to everything during reconstruction, including spaces that were usually sealed off. Someone could have hidden things or moved evidence during all that chaos. He pulled out his phone and showed me photos from the hospital newsletter about the flood damage. The next morning, Detective Barnett called to update me on his investigation progress. He'd been interviewing long-term staff and found a nurse who'd worked here 35 years. She told him about a patient who died in the early 80s under weird circumstances. The official report said natural causes, but nurses whispered it was from too many restraints and sedatives. She said nobody dared ask questions because you'd lose your job for challenging doctors back then. Detective Barnett said he was tracking down more people from that time period. Later that day, Sloan cornered me in the hallway and pulled me into an empty exam room. Her face was red, and she was breathing hard like she'd been running. She said she'd heard I was trying to contact retired staff, and that could get me fired immediately. She kept saying the hospital had procedures, and I was violating them by doing my own investigation. She grabbed my arm and said old employees might say things that weren't true just to get attention or money. I could tell she was scared about what they might reveal from the past. That evening I stayed late reviewing employee records and made an interesting discovery. The nurse whose DNA was on the fake hand had actually worked in room 304 all the time during her shifts. She'd been assigned to that room more than any other nurse on the floor. Someone had picked her tissue specifically to connect her to that exact space. The person who did this knew every detail about staff assignments and room histories. The next day, Kira stopped by my office looking nervous and closed the door behind her. She explained how someone could put DNA onto a fake surface to trick forensic tests. She said you'd need special equipment and chemicals that only labs would have. Her hands were shaking as she described the process and how much planning it would take. She kept looking at the door, like she was afraid someone would walk in and hear us talking. She said whoever did this had to have access to the pathology lab and know exactly what they were doing. After she left, I spent hours searching through old employee directories until I found Lori Bellamy's contact information. She'd been a psychiatric nurse here in the 80s and might remember Mrs. Irwin. I called her number, and at first she didn't want to talk to me at all. But when I mentioned Mrs. De Irwin's name, she got quiet, and then agreed to meet me for coffee. We met at a diner downtown the next morning where nobody from the hospital would see us. Lori was in her 70s with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. She remembered Mrs. Irwin as one of the only nurses who was kind to the psychiatric patients. She said most staff treated them like animals, but Mrs. Irwin would sneak them extra food and blankets. Lori pulled out a napkin and started drawing the old layout of what became room 304. She showed me exactly where the metal bed frame was bolted to the floor for restraints. Patients would be tied down with their arms and legs spread out so they couldn't move at all. She marked 4 X's on the napkin showing where the bolts went into the concrete. The hand had been placed exactly where the left wrist restraint bolt would have been. She said patients would be left like that for days until their wrists and ankles were raw and bleeding. The placement of that fake hand wasn't random, but a message about what happened in that spot. That afternoon, Detective Barnett went to court to request all chemical restraint logs from the psychiatric ward in the 80s. The hospital lawyers showed up to fight it, saying those records were protected and too old to matter. But the judge sided with Detective Barnett and ordered the hospital to turn over everything. 3 days later, dozens of boxes arrived from off-site storage filled with yellowed papers and faded ink. The next morning, Sloan stormed into the records room where I was sorting through the boxes with Detective Barnett. She waved a stack of legal papers in our faces and said we couldn't look at anything older than 20 years without special court approval. Detective Barnett stood up slowly and stared at her with cold eyes. He pulled out his phone and called someone about getting a broader warrant if the hospital kept blocking the investigation. Sloane's face turned red as she listened to him describe her obstruction to whoever was on the other end. The tension in that small room made it hard to breathe. After she left, I kept digging through the papers while Detective Barnett went to meet with the judge. My hands were shaking as I opened folder after folder of old incident reports from the psychiatric ward days. That's when I found it buried in a stack from 1983. Mrs. Irwin's signature appeared as a witness on 3 different restraint injury reports, all from the same month. Her neat handwriting documented patients with broken wrists and torn skin from struggling against the metal restraints. One report described a young man who screamed for hours before going quiet. Mrs. Irwin had written that she tried to get the doctor to check on him, but was told to mind her own business. My stomach turned as I realized someone wanted her to remember these specific incidents. Edison knocked on the door carrying more boxes from the basement archives. He'd found old maintenance records that nobody had looked at in decades. As we went through them together, he pulled out a work order that made us both stop. It was dated 3 weeks after that young man's incident in 1983 and requested urgent tile replacement in the seclusion room. The reason listed was water damage, but Edison said that didn't make sense. The pipes in that area had never leaked according to all the other records. Someone had torn up that floor for a different reason and covered their tracks. Detective Barnett came back with his expanded warrant and immediately started taking photos of everything we'd found. He pointed out something I hadn't noticed about the timing of the planted hand. The smell had been perfectly calibrated to be strong enough for Mrs. Irwin to notice, but not so bad that maintenance would tear up the floor right away. Whoever did this wanted her to suffer for days with that smell, knowing something was wrong, but being unable to prove it. The cruelty of it made me feel sick. During my lunch break, I found myself sitting with one of the older nurses who'd worked here for 20 years. I told her I was thinking about leaving medicine because I couldn't trust myself anymore after what happened with Mrs. Irwin. She grabbed my hand and said, making mistakes was how doctors learned to be better, but the guilt was eating me alive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd killed Mrs. Irwin by not believing her. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Irwin's daughter called and asked if she could bring me something. She arrived an hour later with a cardboard box full of her mother's old nursing things. Inside were shift calendars and handwritten notes from the 80s, along with photos of the staff back then. One journal entry from 1983 made me stop breathing for a moment. Mrs. Irwin had written about a young patient who begged not to be restrained again right before he died. She described his voice as desperate, and how she'd never forgotten the sound of his crying. The entry was dated the same week as those injury reports I'd found. I spent the rest of the day cross-referencing the dates and patient codes in the various records. Patient 304-83 kept appearing in different documents, always with vague notes about behavioral issues. The medication logs showed he'd been given massive doses of sedatives in his final days. The death certificate said natural causes, but the drug amounts would have killed anyone. This was murder, hidden behind medical treatment. The next morning, Sloan called me into her office and told me I was removed from patient care immediately. She said it was for my own protection while the investigation continued, but I knew she just wanted me away from the ward. She assigned me to administrative work in the basement filing old insurance claims. My medical career was hanging by a thread, and we both knew it. Detective Barnett found me in the basement that afternoon and closed the door behind him. He told me to get a lawyer immediately and protect myself legally. He said someone on current staff was definitely involved based on the evidence patterns. He promised to keep sharing updates with me, but warned that I couldn't trust anyone in the hospital anymore. As he left, he mentioned plans to subpoena even more records from the pathology department. 2 days later, Kira from the lab stopped by the basement, looking nervous and pale. She mentioned finding weird discrepancies in the old pathology inventory from 1983, including a specimen jar that was mislabeled. Her hands shook as she described having nightmares about what might be hidden in those old storage rooms. She kept looking over her shoulder like someone might be watching us. The guilt on her face was obvious as she talked about how the lab had always been sloppy with record-keeping back then. The next morning, I went straight to the security office and asked for badge access logs for the past 6 months. The guard behind the desk looked confused, but pulled up the records on his computer. I wanted to see who could get into the maintenance areas under the ward. The list was shorter than I expected, with only 12 names showing regular access. Most were maintenance workers, but 3 names stood out as long-term employees who'd been here over 20 years. Edison Walker was on the list, along with 2 other supervisors who'd worked here since the 80s. Someone with that kind of knowledge about the building would know exactly where to hide things and when to plant them. I printed the list and headed to meet Lori at a coffee shop downtown. She was already waiting in a corner booth, looking nervous and checking her watch every few minutes. When I sat down, she immediately started talking about Timothy, without me even asking. She said she'd always known something was wrong with how he died, but nobody would listen to a young nurse back then. The doctors had all the power, and questioning them meant losing your job and never working in healthcare again. She described watching them increase his meds every day until he could barely open his eyes. The restraints left marks on his wrists that got infected, but they just covered them with bandages and kept him tied down. She said the culture of silence was so strong that nurses would pretend not to see things just to keep their jobs. The same system that let them kill Timothy was the one that dismissed Mrs. Irwin 40 years later. Nothing had really changed except the methods got more subtle. Detective Barnett called while I was driving back to the hospital and told me he'd found something weird about the security system. The new electronic badges were supposed to be foolproof, but there was a gap in coverage. Anyone with an old master key from before the digital upgrade could still access certain areas without leaving an electronic trail. He'd checked the records and found that several veteran employees had never turned in their old keys when the system changed. The hospital just assumed everyone would use the new badges and forgot about the physical locks that still worked. This explained how someone could get to the subfloor without showing up on any logs. I sat in my car in the parking garage thinking about the DNA on that fake hand. It hit me that the hospital kept old employee health screening samples in the pathology archive for research purposes. Anyone with access to those files could harvest genetic material from dozens of former staff members. Blood samples, hair follicles, even saliva swabs from TB tests were all stored down there. The person who did this had probably been collecting materials for years, waiting for the right moment. Edison found me in the basement filing room that afternoon and closed the door behind him. He'd been mapping the building's service areas and discovered something nobody else knew about. There was a crawl space that connected directly to the area under room 304 with no cameras or security monitoring at all. It was part of the original construction from the 1940s and wasn't on any current blueprints. Someone who knew about that passage could move through the building like a ghost, planting evidence wherever they wanted. The entrance was hidden behind a utility panel that looked sealed but actually opened with the right tool. Detective Barnett got his warrant approved faster than expected and arrived with a team to search the pathology archive. The judge had agreed that something systematic was going on that required full investigation. Box after box of preserved samples came out of storage, some dating back 50 years. Old specimen jars with faded labels, tissue samples in formaldehyde, and forgotten evidence from cases nobody remembered anymore. The forensic team set up a processing area in an empty conference room and started cataloging everything. I went down to help organize the materials and found Kira already there. She'd been crying, and her eyes were red and puffy. She kept staring at specific shelves like she knew exactly what was hidden there. When I asked if she was okay, she just shook her head and whispered something about making things right. Her hands were shaking as she pointed out which boxes contained samples from the 80s. She knew way too much about what was stored where for someone who'd only worked here 10 years. Sloane pulled me into her office later that day and locked the door. She looked exhausted and defeated as she sat down across from me. She admitted the hospital had quietly settled 3 different whistleblower complaints in the past decade. All of them involved staff members who'd questioned patient care standards or reported suspicious deaths. She'd been the one negotiating the settlements and making sure nothing went public. Each time she convinced herself she was protecting the hospital's reputation, but really, she was just enabling more cover-ups. The same culture that killed Timothy and dismissed Mrs. Irwin was still alive, because people like her kept protecting it. She handed me a folder with copies of the settlement agreements, finally ready to stop hiding the truth. Detective Barnett's team found what they were looking for in a box labeled for disposal, but never actually thrown away. The specimen jar had been mislabeled as educational materials, but inside was tissue preserved from patient 304-83. The DNA testing confirmed it was from Timothy, the young man who died in that room in 1983. Someone had kept pieces of him all these years like a trophy, or evidence of what happened. Mrs. Irwin had been right to feel something dark in that room because a murder victim's remains were literally stored beneath the hospital. I found Kira in the break room that evening and sat down across from her. The guilt on her face was obvious now that I knew what to look for. I told her I knew she was involved somehow and that it was time to tell the truth. She broke down completely, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Between gasps, she admitted she'd known about Timothy's preserved tissue for years. She'd found it by accident while doing inventory and realized what it meant. The weight of keeping that secret had been destroying her from the inside. She started talking faster now, words spilling out like water from a broken dam. She told me how she'd found Timothy's tissue samples 5 years ago while doing routine inventory in the old storage area. The jar was mislabeled, but she recognized the patient code from cross-referencing old records. She'd spent months piecing together what happened to him back in 1983. The more she learned about the restraints and overdoses, the angrier she got. When she heard Mrs. Irwin was admitted to room 304, she saw her chance. She knew Mrs. Irwin had worked that floor during Timothy's death. She thought if Mrs. Irwin found evidence, people would finally have to listen. She'd taken DNA from an old hairbrush the nurse left behind years ago and used her lab access to create the fake hand. She'd snuck into the maintenance tunnels late at night and placed it under the floor tiles. She sealed it just enough to let the smell seep through slowly. She never thought Mrs. Irwin would die from the stress. She just wanted someone to investigate Timothy's murder after 40 years of silence. Her whole body shook as she confessed everything. Detective Barnett arrived within an hour after I called him. He listened to Kira repeat her confession while recording everything on his phone. He didn't interrupt or judge, just let her talk until she ran out of words. When she finished, he set down a cooperation agreement he'd already prepared. He said if she told them everything about the cover-up and who else knew, the prosecutor would recommend reduced charges. She signed immediately without even reading it, desperate to make things right somehow. The investigation shifted completely after that. Instead of hunting for a mysterious perpetrator, they were now exposing an entire system of cover-ups. Barnett's team started pulling records from dozens of suspicious deaths during the psychiatric ward era. Sloan called an emergency meeting that afternoon. She looked defeated as she stood at the conference table. She said the hospital needed to get ahead of this before it destroyed them completely. She'd been up all night with the legal team, and they all agreed that transparency was their only option now. The cover-up had become more dangerous than admitting the truth. She handed out packets outlining a new cooperation strategy with investigators. Even someone like her had limits to what she'd protect. The hospital would open all records from the psychiatric ward era and assist with the investigation. They'd also establish a fund for victims' families and implement new oversight systems. She looked sick saying it, but she knew they had no choice anymore. I stepped out to call Mrs. Irwin's daughter before the news went public. My hands shook as I dialed her number. When she answered, I told her we'd discovered what really happened in that room. I explained about Timothy's murder in 1983 and how someone had planted evidence to expose it. I told her that her mother had been right all along about sensing something evil there. She started crying hard on the phone. She said her mom died knowing something terrible had happened, but no one believed her. We stayed on the phone for 20 minutes, sharing our grief over failing Mrs. Irwin. She thanked me for finally listening, even though it was too late. The next morning, the hospital held a press conference in the main auditorium. The administrator stood at the podium reading from prepared notes while reporters packed the room. She acknowledged systematic failures during the psychiatric ward era that led to patient deaths. She announced a complete review of all cold cases from that time period. Her voice cracked as she apologized to the families affected by decades of institutional silence. She looked genuinely sick, having to admit these failures publicly. Reporters shouted questions, but she stuck to her script. The hospital would cooperate fully with law enforcement and provide resources for a thorough investigation. They were also establishing new oversight committees to prevent future tragedies. Detective Barnett took the podium next to announce the formal murder investigation into Timothy's death from 1983. He explained that while most people involved were now deceased or elderly, justice still mattered. His team would pursue every lead and hold anyone still alive accountable for their roles. The truth needed to come out even after 40 years. The crowd erupted with more questions, but he kept his answers brief and professional. 2 days later, Kira was formally charged with evidence tampering and interfering with human remains. The judge released her on bail after she agreed to testify about everything she knew. She stood in the courtroom accepting responsibility, while also exposing the broader conspiracy. Her lawyer explained how she'd acted out of desperation to reveal a murder that everyone else had ignored. Some people in the gallery actually nodded with understanding. Her courage in confessing earned her some respect despite her crimes. The hospital called me into a disciplinary meeting that week. They gave me a formal reprimand for overstepping boundaries during the investigation. But in the same meeting, they asked me to join their new patient safety committee. They said they needed someone who'd learned the hard way about listening to patients. My career survived, but it was completely transformed. I'd never practice medicine the same way again. The hospital's legal team started settlement negotiations with both Mrs. Irwin's daughter and Timothy's surviving sister. They offered financial compensation, along with a formal apology program. The lawyers worked out details over several weeks of intense meetings. The institution finally acknowledged its deadly failures after decades of denial. Money couldn't bring back the dead, but the acknowledgement mattered to the families. Our new safety committee met every week to implement sweeping changes. We created policies requiring immediate investigation of any patient complaint, regardless of mental status. We installed new locks and monitoring systems for all subfloor access points. We mandated that any unusual odor reports be escalated to facilities management within 2 hours. Every change we made traced back to Mrs. Irwin's suffering and death. 3 weeks later, Lori sat in the prosecutor's office signing page after page of her sworn statement about the psychiatric ward. Her hands shook slightly as she described the leather restraints they used to strap patients down for days at a time. She detailed how supervisors ordered extra sedatives when patients screamed too loud and disturbed the other wards. The prosecutor recorded everything while taking notes about specific incidents she remembered from 1983. Lori kept wiping tears from her eyes as she talked about patients who died during her shifts and how the death certificates always listed natural causes. She named the supervisor who ordered Timothy's final dose of sedatives and described finding his body still strapped to the bed the next morning. The prosecutor showed her old medication logs, and she confirmed the handwriting belonged to various staff members from that era. After 4 hours of testimony, She finally finished, and the prosecutor thanked her for her courage in coming forward. Lori stood up, looking somehow lighter than when she'd arrived, and told them she should have spoken up 40 years ago. The following month, contractors finished renovating room 304 and removed all traces of its dark history. I walked into the bright medical room carrying 2 small bouquets of flowers I'd bought from the gift shop downstairs. The walls were freshly painted white, and new equipment lined the counters where the old restraint anchors used to be. I placed 1 bouquet on the windowsill for Mrs. Irwin and whispered an apology for not believing her when she needed me most. The second bouquet went on the bedside table for Timothy, acknowledging the young man who died in this exact spot 40 years ago. The room felt different now, cleaner somehow, like opening windows after a long winter. I stayed there for 20 minutes just standing quietly and thinking about all the suffering these walls had witnessed. 2 days later, the lead prosecutor called to update me on their investigation into Timothy's death. They'd tracked down the supervisor Lori had named, a 90-year-old man now living in a memory care facility with advanced dementia. His family had been shocked to learn about the allegations, but after reviewing the evidence, they agreed to a symbolic plea on his behalf. The prosecutor explained that while criminal prosecution wasn't possible given his mental state, the formal acknowledgement of his crimes mattered for the historical record. The family's lawyer read a statement accepting responsibility for the supervisor's actions and expressing regret for Timothy's death. The judge entered the plea into the official record, ensuring that Timothy's murder would finally be recognized by the legal system even if justice came too late for real accountability. That same week, the hospital board announced the creation of the Irwin Patient Advocacy Fund during a packed press conference. The fund would provide resources for families challenging medical decisions and investigating suspicious deaths in healthcare facilities. They allocated $2 million in initial funding and promised to match all public donations for the first year. The administrator read a prepared statement acknowledging that Mrs. Irwin's case exposed serious failures in how they responded to patient concerns. Her name would now be permanently linked to protecting vulnerable patients and ensuring their voices were heard. Several reporters asked questions about other potential cases, and the administrator promised full transparency going forward. Meanwhile, Kira appeared in court to formally accept her plea deal with the prosecutor's office. She stood before the judge and surrendered her medical license, accepting 5 years of probation for evidence tampering and interfering with an investigation. The judge approved her agreement to work with the new Patient Safety Fund developing protocols to prevent future tragedies. Kira's voice cracked as she apologized to Mrs. Irwin's family and promised to spend the rest of her career making amends for her actions. The prosecutor noted that her early cooperation and genuine remorse had influenced their decision to avoid jail time. After the hearing, Kira immediately started working with the fund to create new training materials about recognizing and reporting suspicious deaths. 6 months after everything came to light, I met Mrs. Irwin's daughter at the new memorial plaque the hospital installed in their garden. The bronze plaque listed both Mrs. Irwin and Timothy's names, along with a dedication to all patients whose voices went unheard. Mrs. Irwin's daughter touched the plaque gently, while I explained all the changes her mother's suffering had inspired throughout the hospital system. I told her about the new protocols, the advocacy fund, and the mandatory training for all staff about taking patient complaints seriously. She listened quietly, then turned to me with tears in her eyes and said her mother would want healing more than revenge. We stood together in the garden for a long time, both of us processing our grief and finding some small comfort in knowing the truth had finally come out. Over the next year, our entire ward culture transformed as new policies took effect throughout the hospital. Staff meetings now started with reviewing every patient complaint from the previous week, no matter how minor they seemed. We implemented a rapid response system where any unusual odor report triggered immediate investigation within 2 hours. Nurses received training on documenting patient concerns without judgment and escalating them through proper channels. The old attitude of dismissing difficult patients as problematic slowly gave way to seeing their distress as valuable information. Trust between staff and patients began rebuilding through hundreds of small actions, proving we'd truly changed. Even now, 3 years later, I still wake up some nights thinking about Mrs. Irwin grabbing my arm and begging me to believe her. The guilt will never fully leave me, but I've learned to channel it into purposeful action. Every week, I teach rounds to medical residents and share Mrs. Irwin's story as a warning about the dangers of dismissing patients. I tell them that our medical degrees don't make us infallible, and that sometimes the patient with dementia sees more clearly than the doctor with decades of experience. Her ghost walks with me through the hospital halls, a constant reminder that listening saves lives while dismissal can kill. And that's a wrap on today's video. I love sharing these moments with you all so much. Hit subscribe, and let's keep the good energy flowing.